Oh, it's okay. I'll squint through it, but yes, I've got to get in the habit of bringing my readers. Yeah.
All right, are we on?
Yeah.
All right, let's call the meeting to order. It is September 5th, 2017, 6:30 p.m. This is the meeting of the Easthampton Historical Commission. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. We have two sets of minutes, one from August 1st, which was our last regular meeting, and a second one from the public hearing, demolition of the Williston buildings on Main Street. There's any corrections or additions to the first set, August 1st? Entertain a motion to approve. If not,
I move to approve. You're here for that meeting, right?
Yes.
get a second?
Second.
Second, okay. All in favor, approving as written? Aye. So those are approved. Second set was the public hearing, demolition. Pretty much what
I wrote them, so I'm gonna.
Okay, so we have a motion to
Yes.
approve.
Yeah.
Approved, okay, and all in favor?
Aye.
Approved as written. Very good. Okay, public speak. Okay. Correspondence, I haven't gotten anything.
Nothing.
I didn't check this week.
Well, actually, there was a CPA email.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
So, I don't know if that falls under correspondence.
I suppose it would, but I didn't print it out, so, we're talking about what?
Their CPA's doing the
Oh, CPA.
preservation, the annual preservation plan update, and as a,
Okay.
I saw on the agenda there was the project 2017-18, so that's what they're looking to understand if there's.
Significant structures and.
Yeah,
oh,
just.
priorities, yeah, okay.
And then there was also, the chapter for the historic preservation was included, and if there were any comments on that.
Great.
So people want to take a look at that and then just respond individually, or if the committee wants to discuss it and then respond as a group.
I have not looked at it closely, so
Either's fine.
we can table that for the next meeting. CPA email? Did I get it?
I did.
So I must have gotten it. I thought I did. There's also the Mass Historical Commission meeting in Lowell on September 22nd.
Mhm.
You can go. They're looking for some volunteers, so reduce your rate to $25. I was just looking at that tonight, so that is a Friday. Let's see.
Do you all get those emails?
Mm-hmm.
Did you get it?
I got that one.
Invitation.
Don't know who that comes under.
The Mass
Oh, right here.
Western Mass
Yeah,
Historical.
local preservation of it. Yes, historic conference, September 22nd in historic downtown Lowell.
That could be fun.
I went once. It was good.
Yeah, it's looking so far like I have a conflict or I would go.
Yeah. You went to the website?
Yeah, you can send it to me.
Okay. I'll forward this to you, actually. How does that sound? If we can figure it out. Okay. Anyways, I will forward that to you. Okay, item number 5. Huh?
I got it from.
Item number 5 is the Historical Commission's duties and responsibilities. Do you want to speak to that? You just told me before.
So I've looked in the charter, there's nothing written other than consists of 7 members. I mean, struck out recently because it was changed to 5, so that's the only thing that's in the charter for Historical Commission. In the city ordinances, the only thing really in the Historic Commission is the demo delay ordinance. So that's, as far as I can tell, the only sort of official duties and responsibilities of the commission are the demo delay ordinance. There might be things that are that I,
Maintaining the register, I think.
yeah, I mean, there are things that,
Yeah.
but that, I guess that's the only thing that was written down.
So in speaking to that, I spoke with the mayor, and she said, well, draft your mission statement on what you want to do, and, you know, so that's kind of, you know, a little brainstorming session now as to what we want to be responsible for, or feel like we should be responsible for. So if anybody's got anything, what was you had an item there?
Well, maintaining the register of historic properties in town.
Right.
Maintaining and updating the,
Okay, so like number one is actually demolition delay, right, which is already written down.
Northampton was very late in starting their demolition delay. I mean, there were a lot of historic houses that got destroyed because they didn't have one. But when they finally instituted one just a couple of years ago, they did the demo delay for a year.
So we can always work on.
And that's
changing
by our ordinance, it just says 6 months.
Right, because that's old. I mean, I was on one of the original historic commission. And that's, I mean, we're talking back in the 70s.
And we know how time was slower back then.
I wondered if we ought to think about what the objective of that is and what we might be
Excuse me,
able
sorry
to
to bother you. If there's a hearing happening, where would that be?
Top floor.
Top floor, thanks.
You know, I believe that the intention of it is to try to prevent people from just being able to go in and knock something down.
Right.
But it still feels fairly toothless, because so far, all anybody does is just wait and then knock it down. So, you know.
You could, right.
Well,
Sorry.
Good.
when I was reading the ordinance, it seemed like it was a 6-month minimum, and then they have to prove to the historical commission that they've done, that they've actually tried to find other avenues other than knocking it down. And so theoretically, if they just wait and don't actually do anything, the historical commission can then say, fine, another 6 months, another 6 months, another 6 months.
Okay, so you can keep tacking it on again if they haven't illustrated that they've really made an attempt.
That was my reading of it, but, you know, we may wanna
I mean, we could,
Well,
try
that's
to
interesting.
clarify that before the next hearing
Because
comes up.
that would be ideal, because that would give us what I would assume the intention behind it is the ability to say, no, we don't want you to tear that down, and we're looking for something to happen so that it doesn't get lost.
You know, with the Merrick House that was on Main Street, which was one of the most interesting historic houses in town. It was a huge house, and Boyle wanted to convert it into so many apartments, and the town said he could convert it into one less than what he wanted because of the
well, it's
size.
kind of open-ended there, I would say.
And we ended up doing a demo delay on it, and the commission actually looked into a lot of different options to see if somebody would buy it for a bed and breakfast. It was a beautiful house. It's where those ugly apartments are on Main Street. And he waited the 6 months and tore it down, put up the ugly apartments. Despite our efforts to try and find some other avenue.
Well, see, that's the thing, I mean, if nobody comes forward that's gonna say, well, I'll take that over, or, you know, or pay the price that the owner is looking for, you know?
Well, I guess that's what I would assume this is about, because obviously, if they didn't have to prove anything, they would just say, yeah, nobody came forward to offer me what I would want.
Right.
They would just do it. So it seems like the whole intention of the demo delay is to give some.
Give them the responsibility of looking for
Well, yeah.
possibilities other than.
And then if it's true that we could say like, yeah, look, it doesn't look like you really made an effort, and then tackle on another 6 months and another 6 months, then there would be some recourse to do something if somebody was after something that was really
Mhm.
significant to us.
We'll look at 6 and 7. That's the, I mean, it's not really clear,
No, it's not.
but it says no permit can be issued for a minimum of 6 months,
Right,
or until the historic commission says that,
it's okay.
sorry, no demo permit can be for 6 months, or until the historical commission says it's okay, or that there's,
Yeah,
that the historic commission's.
Well, if you're looking at it like, well, this house is kind of, another 6 months, this house isn't gonna be standing anyways. Or nobody's gonna come up with that much money to rehab this place, so,
Right.
I think that's what they're looking for.
Right, well,
you're
that's what
saying.
you're looking for, is
Yeah.
that there's a genuine effort and to find some person to own it,
Yeah,
and
well,
no other options,
I
that
think,
all
I
the
think
other options have been
the
exhausted.
no reasonable likelihood that anything's gonna happen besides the thing sitting there.
Right,
I mean, like 115 Main Street was sitting there empty for 10+ years. And if we demo delayed that for 6 months and 6 months, and it would have probably been sitting there empty for another 10 years.
right.
So what's the sense at that point,
Well, obviously, we have to choose our battles, but I
Right.
think
Yeah.
Yeah.
we want the ability to be able to do something, no matter how bad the owner or contractor wants to tear it down. We need some recourse that if we really feel it's significant, and, in my time here, I don't know that anything really horrible has come up. And I think that part of the master plan, I was on it, I helped write it. I know that one of the things we all agreed on was that as much as we like to keep things that are old, not everything that's old should be kept. We would never be a town that grew.
Mhm.
So you really have to, I recognize the value of being picky about which things we really, that's the hill I'm gonna die on.
Right.
I get it, we don't do that all the time, and I'm the first one to say, yeah, there are things that I think we just have to let go for the greater good.
Right.
But if it were ever to come up to a test, I'd like to believe that there was something we could do to actually say, no, you can't do that. We're gonna get in the way in every way possible, no matter how much millions they think they might make once they demolish it and put up a parking garage. It's,
Tongo Church, for example, wanted to take down the parsonage, and we put a demo delay on that, and enough people in the church came up and saved it.
Yeah.
yeah.
But, the farm on McFur Avenue too.
Right, that was another one, yeah.
Yeah.
So, we had a couple of successes, we had a
Yeah.
couple that, went nowhere. I mean, there's a lot more
So-
than just, yes,
Sorry.
that's okay.
I guess within that currently, the ordinance is currently written, if it's not clear, then
Rewrite it.
then I think that we can rewrite it, or, work with city council to have it rewritten.
Right.
Or change the number of months.
How would we go about doing that?
The committee would
Step
just
it.
write a proposal saying like, we think that, you write a letter
Yep.
to the ordinance subcommittee, because they're the ones, the city council ordinance subcommittee is in charge of all the ordinances in the city, and if you had proposed language, or here's how we'd like to see it changed, and then they meet, and someone from the historical commission would have to be at that meeting to sort of represent it. They'd eventually come to a public hearing, and then it would get sent to the full city council for a vote. So it's in the city council's jurisdiction, but they won't necessarily do anything with it unless the historical commission says, hey, this thing
This
is
is our, Yeah.
bizarre, not working, or not clear, or whatever, and,
Right.
as I was, dealing with it, it makes sense that this is the committee that makes those
Mhm.
proposals too.
Yeah.
Thank God for Nikki.
Well, yeah, well, and that's the issue, not the issue, but, kind of what I was trying to get out before. We had kind of two houses on each end of Maine that, one where somebody with some deep pockets wanted to make an impression, and the other one where the guy wanted to, need the space.
For what?
He was gonna-
Parking lot.
Yeah, he wants to put a parking lot there, which also frees up the other building on Main Street to be sold.
Which other building?
The Moriarty building, the old gas station.
He's gonna sell it.
That's,
That's
that's
the one
that's only
that's the one that
supposition,
should've
but,
been torn down.
well, it's, the thing is, that frees up those parking spaces that he's using for his properties on Main Street
Mhm.
behind there, so he can't really do anything until he can relocate those parkers. Which, All right, so anyways, we got, maintain a register of historic properties, update inventories, maintain and update, right? What else do you wanna take on?
CPA occasionally asks the historical commission to make determinations as to whether or not a building or a resource or a structure is historically significant to the town, or to the city rather.
Right.
So
Okay, so determinations of historical significance.
We have a couple historic, we have a couple, one national historic district and one, we have the Main Street National Historic District, and then
Yeah.
there's the Nashwanik Mills Complex, that's a new historic district. I don't know, I think it's another national historic district.
Yes, it's, at least those,
Yeah.
it's Riverside and.
It's Riverside and the Button Building.
Who's the Button Building?
Mhm.
And
15 Cottage.
I know 15 Cottage actually,
And
there's
there's
a whole procedure on that because I think they needed it for.
Well, that's why
Tax.
it went through, is because they needed, in order to get historic tax credits, they had to be on the National Historic Register,
And so they did.
and so they went through the process and got it done. And we don't have any historic district regulations. Some municipalities do. And I think that, going back to what John said earlier with the historic, the master plan, there is this desire to not be a Williamsburg or a Deerfield. That the city, people in the city want to have flexibility with historic preservation. So those, having some sort of historic
Guidelines.
architectural standards and guidelines is at odds with the sort of free spirit of, but then we end up with, things in historic district being taken down or being modified and having
Historic.
no review or anything like that, so.
Yeah, that, right. I mean, one district is basically with Main Street from, obviously, like one Northampton Street up to how far?
I would think through the block.
Do you know?
Yeah, it's from
No, it
basically
goes-
Northampton Street to
Is it Payson?
Center Street.
Center Street, okay.
And then there's the Main Street extension, which went from Center Street to, basically Glendale Street, but that's not a National Historic District, that's just listed on the state register as historic.
That's almost more, well, obviously Williston's got part of that, right?
Yeah. So mostly this is the historic houses, and the Main Street Historic District is
That wouldn't be,
Shop-
that
shop
wouldn't be, that
row
wouldn't be a
and the-
bad addition to that though, because most of those homes are in pretty nice shape and, you know.
And I'm keen to point out too that the old Poor Farm is also, I believe, on that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's on the historic register,
And City Hall has its own,
right, yeah.
the old town hall.
I was told that mine should be listed on National Historic.
All right, and also the US Post, the post office,
Oh,
now the
so-
senior
so-
center.
Senior
that's
center.
right, yep. Well, okay.
You know, one of the things in the long run I'd like to propose is a map.
Mm.
I had started one for the master plan
Mhm.
and had.
Mapping the historic areas.
Yeah, yeah. At that time, I didn't have anything official, so it was really mostly historical interest.
Yeah, just threw that down on projects.
Yeah. And then there was also a request to put an overlay, which I did on for what were called historic landscapes.
Mhm.
So those were the things that weren't houses and buildings, and the one that was most significant was the mountainside. It was pointed out that currently we have insufficient protections for what could go up there that would obviously radically influence the view of,
The mountains in Easthampton though.
Right. So, I guess a little of it is some of it going up the slope, but I think all anyone could
Maybe
say was.
Christopher Clark Road might be the ending of which you can't see from, except when they took the trees down with the storm.
Yeah, and then there was like the roundabout and stuff like that, which sort of didn't fall into the traditional,
Yeah.
A building kind of thing. So there were a few. So again, I think it'd be useful for us as well as for any visitors or tourists or people doing research or interest in the town.
Mhm.
What have they been doing on Ferry Street below that little dam?
At the One Ferry Street complex.
They put in a new water line.
Is that what it was?
Yep.
The
The
water
one,
main?
the one that was
to-
under the bridge is actually starting to do this and fall apart, so we replaced it before it did.
That was a good thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was in the works for a couple of years, actually.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any word on him and what he's doing with One Ferry Street?
Well, there's rumors somebody wants to buy it. How far along that's going or whatever, I don't know.
He's still asking like $1 million for it.
I hope not.
Last year, like 3,
3 million?
so
He wanted 3.
something like that.
That's the posted price.
Yeah.
That's what he wants.
Yeah.
You know what they bought it for?
A song.
Like 85,000 or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, it was crazy, crazy low. Anyway, I think, at this point, well, at least with this section right here, I mean, we maybe brainstorm what you want, and
Yeah.
we can always move on to, to other things, and if we have some ideas, then we can start drafting a statement.
Yeah.
I mean, we got a few things here that we already have, that we know we should be doing, and possibly draft that into some kind of document and add to it, if you have any other ideas or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I thought for the mission statement, looking at the master plan as like a starting point
Yeah.
was a good place to at least look at. Because that's at least a public document that's been vetted by a large part of the community. And I think that there are a couple of things in there that would go very nicely into a mission statement.
Could you get us, you have a copy of it? Master plan?
It's
Yeah,
available, it's
yeah,
available
available
online,
online,
I
okay.
can,
Yeah.
I can send out a link to it, or.
There's a PDF, which is nice because that's searchable,
Right.
that you can
Well,
download.
I mean, just that one chapter would be nice to have a paper copy of it, because you can write all over it.
Yeah.
A couple of them,
Yeah.
3 of them maybe.
Yeah, I can, do you want me to send that email out, or do you want me to just have some copies, like hard copies at the next meeting?
Just some hard copies, like 3 or 4, 5.
Okay.
5.
Who else is on the committee now, besides
Nora.
And
Nora
just,
Roloff.
or just the 5?
Otherwise, we can talk about this until 10 o'clock tonight. So, why don't we, think about it and, just, bounce things around. Next time we can go through that.
Might be good to get Bob Schwab's take on it.
Good. Charles,
I
heard
haven't
from him or
heard
anything?
about how he's doing.
Right.
I don't know if I still have his phone number since they moved to Southampton.
I think I have his number. I don't think, well, he was living in Southampton, just on the committee.
Right.
Yeah, and the other, at the end of the master plan chapter is a bunch of goals and strategies for historic preservation. So again, that might play into.
Yeah, I think it's great, it's a great starting point,
Yeah.
for what we need to kind of do here. All right, so why don't we table that until next time, and we'll move along, we'll just go over these projects again, and just to keep everybody refreshed on this. Building inventories. You're gonna look to the CPA for some funds to get that rolling. Beverly's gonna be the point person on that?
I am.
Yeah. We elected you. Well, if you could, I mean, it'd be nice to have one person that's kind of like, keeping it moving. In case we,
What does that mean, the building inventories? Is
So
there-
basically, what you got here, these.
Okay, so it's updating the 1990 or 1988.
Well, yeah, they're from the
Historic.
80s or the 90s,
Historic.
and, their house is 50 years old or
Yeah.
older, and,
Yeah, we had
Certain
someone,
sections of town.
Margaret, what was her name, came in as she was in graduate school, older woman in graduate school at UMass, and she came in and completed the inventories at that point.
Okay.
The inventories up to then had been done by members of the committee doing the research, but there were a lot more houses that needed to be done, and she got paid to do it, so I don't know if we could pay someone
Well,
with
that's,
historical
that's,
background.
that's what the
CPA
CPA has money for. If we
Yeah.
can identify.
Find someone again.
If we can identify consultants, and we know that there's like people who we could hire, then the historical commission could come to the CPA to request money, and then issue an RFP that people would bid on, or that contractor consultants would bid on to do that work. So it would be, project management or oversight, from you wouldn't necessarily be doing the work, but you'd be making sure that, or we'd be making sure that the
Work gets done.
That the work gets done, that the right things are being done, and,
She was very good, and she went to the whole town.
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw it out there too, that I would think the building inventory is the highest priority.
Yeah.
Out of all the things that we would start with. And then maybe the cemetery inventory is next, I'm not sure.
that could be. Well, probably, building inventories, maybe priorities for the CPA, just the one that's fairly simple and, it is kind of important.
Well, and it gives us a reference point for other things, other
Right.
decisions that might need to get made.
I mean, at least at the minimum of just coming up with a list of properties without doing the inventory on each one is I think a big project in itself. There's something like 6,000 or 8,000 lots in the city. So there's 6,000 lots. So
Yeah, probably 6,000.
and I think something like, at least of the residential units, I think about 2/3 or half are over 50 years.
Yes.
Years old. So I mean, it's a lot of.
Of course, some of the inventory, a lot of the older houses have been done already,
Right.
so it
And
would
some of
seem.
them have been so renovated that they wouldn't be worth doing.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what the number one, I don't know what the criteria is as far as which ones would be inventory and not inventory.
That's what Margaret did,
Right.
was she would look at them and determine, whether they were worth inventorying, and then she would do the research on it.
Yeah.
I don't remember her last name.
It's in my brain, but it's not coming out. Those are Kepler's all the way down.
When we started the commission years ago, we had to do it. We picked out houses downtown, and everybody on the commission had to write the reports on it. Go to the registry of deeds and look up the histories.
And
This was
then
back in the 70s, I would say.
it's quite a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
Full-time job.
Yeah. CPA is also, it's not just historic buildings, but it's also historic landscapes, historic objects, historic, anything that could be considered historic can be covered by CPA.
Right.
So
Right. So which.
I don't know if the historical commission, just in practice, is limited to buildings.
No, the fountain in the center and the rotary, that was one of the things that's, the fountain that was
No,
in front of Old Town Hall.
Right.
And we even discussed the canal and all of
Yeah.
that.
Right, so the historic landscapes.
Right, well, also besides that, we're talking about doing the ground penetrating radar over on Clap Street.
Right.
So, yeah, not just buildings, although buildings seem to be
They're the
biggest
low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, everybody sees them, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then wherever we have historic sites, those are, prime sites for development, because they're generally fields or
Right.
easily developed places, so those are, maybe not low-hanging fruit, but they are susceptible to degradation.
You also kind of opened up a segue for something I had wanted to bring up too, which is, so I assume everybody knows about the library, what's going on with
Mhm.
foundation
Yeah.
and I gather everything has moved over to, or is moving over to
I
Eastwards.
think they're moving a portion of it.
Is it another portion? 'Cause
They're moving what needs to be moved, so that way they can access.
Right.
That was my question,
They're
because-
redoing the whole children's section, youth section of the libraries, which is the basement.
That's where the historic objects collection is,
Right.
is in the
Well,
basement.
they're throwing
So
all
that
that
was-
out.
Yeah, well, that was, so that was kind of my question was,
It was actually, I don't have the.
I
brochure
wonder,
with me.
yeah, is that moving and
It's being stored, I believe.
right. And if it is, I don't know, I mean, in my world, that would be a good time then, if everything's coming out, to digitize and or document those things, that would be a good time to do it, because you're already having them move everything and account for it. That's a big other project. Again, sorry to just be throwing projects willy-nilly out there, but I also had talked to the library director years ago, somebody who's long since moved on, but there was a lot of interest, and a lot can be done now. I don't know if everybody's aware of it, but even when you have an object like a musket or a bowl, even though it's photography, now a lot of museums even use a method where you can look around the object and turn it around and things like that. So while it's just photography, it also is very accessible, and teachers and students use it a lot. And if something horrible were to happen, at least you have
A record.
a pretty decent record. And when I asked, I don't even think that full inventory was available. It wasn't like you could search through to say, do you have a stereograph of the old town hall, for example? they do, but I know that simply because I digitized one. But there wasn't any means by which to really access that, and it wasn't, you know, we're not making much use of it, and it's one of the things that I wonder if in the long run we wouldn't want to really look at that collection and
That
maybe
is,
digitize it.
of course, the library is a separate entity than
Right,
the rest of the
not
town
public.
too, so then you might be
So it might
stepping
be on
on
them.
Yeah, stepping on some toes or whatever, you know.
But again,
I'm not
that's-
sure.
I mean, I think the historical commission has, it's a, you know.
We have whatever power we say we have.
Right, and like, if the historical commission wants to form a partnership with the library to
Well-
do this thing, or, you know, the Easthampton Historical Society to do their stuff, like, I don't know anything about that, so.
Neither do I, to tell you the truth, but.
That's a sore point.
So, I
Well,
mean-
those inventories are the kind of thing that if we could, we
Right,
would,
yeah.
we would love.
Because
You
I
know, we
think
can
that
always
would be-
approach them about it
Yeah.
too.
I mean, I think this is the group that is, like you said, the commission is working with other historically minded organizations in the city, then.
Yeah. And I'm happy to broach the subject, but when I
Project
did.
H, Historic
Yeah.
Objects in Library,
Yeah.
digitized John.
Okay,
Okay.
yeah, because when I did talk to the director at that time, they were actually really into it, so.
Yeah.
The current director?
No.
Previous.
Previous director.
Previous, probably, so the way they go through there.
Yeah.
What are the chances of getting a new library?
Well,
And what would they do with the old library?
Well, it's still a historic structure, so regardless of
Its
the
use.
books and things like that, you know, that may be a priority, is getting it listed, getting some sort of restrictions on it. I don't know, I think it's just listed right now, there's nothing, it's part of the National Historic District, but it has no special listing in and of itself.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure it's not on the,
yeah,
Or-
you know, that might be a good one to do. I'm kind of surprised that they haven't, like, you know, they approached us about washing the exterior, and the guy that was gonna do the job went and looked at the library, and he refused to do the job because of the condition of the windows.
right.
So, you know, but they never came back and said, well, can you, you know, approve us, you know, recommend that we can get some windows in here? That would have been kind of a no-brainer for the CPA, I'm sure, you know.
I did have a conversation with one of the volunteers at the library about
Yeah.
CPA funds, and it got into a whole, they just wanted money to do improvements, they didn't want to necessarily do things in a historical manner.
Yeah.
And CPA funds have to be, if it's for historic preservation, and it's for, you know, a physical object, such as the building has to comply with
Right.
the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for historic preservation, which is not what most people want to do. You know, they're more interested in throwing out the existing windows and if there are ways to keep the historic windows and restore
We've
them.
got a couple of window companies in town that would probably be able to, you know, replicate or whatever.
Right.
I mean, there's, you
Yeah,
know, they do
Mhm.
allow replacement materials or whatever.
To answer a question about monuments, here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 monuments listed for just Main Street.
Yeah, but those are just the inventories, or they're on the National Register?
Well, National Register is different than State Register.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, and you keep saying national, but I'm curious because the last I had checked, I was shocked that it seemed like none of these things we're talking about were on the national. The Poor Farm was the only thing that was actually on the National Register when I had looked. So I'm curious if we mean
There's a book in there.
I
state or if it's changed since I had looked it up.
The national,
last I looked,
Like the inventory is in the, Mike, do you remember what's it called?
Let's see.
That's the, because you can
This
look
is
up
last
our
year's.
inventory online,
Oh, you have last year's.
but that's,
I only have like the 2012 version.
that's the state.
That's a state listing and they have a designation in there for whether or not it's, the national, whether or not it's listed on national or not. So,
Wanna see what's on the state register,
What is that?
Moriarty's place?
so that's not the, that's just a listing though, right?
Yeah, that's the
This is
inventory,
just-
that's
This
not,
is the inventory.
the inventory is not
Okay.
a national register though.
No, there's very few on the National Register because of the amount of paperwork it takes to get things on the National Register. I've been told to put my house on the National Register, the paperwork is huge.
So
The
we
ones
have-
that are, certain people have taken it upon
This is the
themselves.
state register.
to-
Now, does it,
NRDS, National Register District. PR is Preservation Restriction, National Register District, National Register District. And then National Register
Farm.
Individual Listing, Preservation Restriction, National Register Individual Listing. So we don't have anything that is not listed. Everything that's on the state register is also on the
National Register.
National
Is it?
Register.
Oh, okay,
so if you want to,
okay, yeah,
so
well,
that's
that's,
the bottom of the page, and
That's-
and top of the other side.
that's good, and I don't know if I just maybe, yeah, well, so, post office to town farm, the Mill District, the Main Street District, and Old Town Hall. And those districts, though, just out of curiosity, do we know if it's in the district, that isn't necessarily a preservation restriction on the buildings though, right? It can
Right.
be in the district and still,
Right, so that's why there's a preservation the town hall's listed both. It's individually listed, it's on the National Register, and it has historic preservation restriction. But the library is in the National Register district, but doesn't have an individual listing and has no preservation restrictions on it.
right. The Poor Farm does,
Right.
and the post office does,
The post office does.
not. National Register, what's IND?
Individual
Individual.
listing. So it's outside of the district, it's just a historic
It doesn't
listing.
have a preservation restriction on
No, it doesn't have
Oh,
preservation
okay.
restriction.
So, but it is listed on the,
it. Yeah. So, yeah, this definitely seems like a high priority for us to add a few things, get maybe some protections for,
right, I mean, the thing is, we don't actually, because of our ordinances, we don't have, a listing on the National Register doesn't protect anything.
right, exactly.
A preservation restriction protects it.
Right.
Or, you know, coming up with some sort of historic district zoning.
Yeah.
And things like that. But that gets very complicated.
Yeah, we have National Register of Historic Places Inventory Nomination Form,
Right.
Easthampton Public Library, 9 Park Street.
But so that was never approved or never filed.
Well, it was, as I understand it, there's a lot more paperwork that has to
Right.
happen. I mean, reams of paperwork.
It's okay.
It was so close.
I see that.
All right.
What's the date on this? Location of legal description is at Hampshire County Registry of Deeds. Trying to find the date.
Let's see.
See instructions on how to complete National Register forms.
Copy's not all that great either.
Hmm?
Copy isn't all that great either.
There's another copy of it. This goes back to 86, when Bill Carroll was on the commission.
This is for the whole historic district.
The Massachusetts Historical Commission is delighted to inform you that the Easthampton Main Street Historic District, Easthampton, Mass. Has been accepted by the National Park Service, Department of the Interior for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. Enclosed is the official National Register certificate, which you may wish to display in your property to make others aware of the National Register program. So it was actually accepted, according to this letter.
That's the district, yeah. Well, we knew that.
We should maybe think about a plaque for Old Town Hall.
Well, not only that, but even like you go into Hatfield, there's entering the Hatfield Historic District.
Maybe even a
So
historical
we could do that
marker.
like in Northampton Street and Pleasant
Yeah.
Street and Main Street or whatever, Okay, this is a historic district here. Kind of like Cottage Street is the cultural district. So, they have signs up for that now, I believe. There's one, right? At least one.
Right to object to listing.
Nobody's objected anymore.
Owners of private properties nominated to the National Register of Historic Places must be given an opportunity to concur in or object to listing in accordance with the National Historic Preservation Act amendments of 1980. Any owner or partial owner of a private property who chooses to object to listing is required to submit to the State Historic Preservation Officer a notarized statement certifying that the party is the sole or partial owner of the private property as appropriate and objects to the listing. And it goes on and on and on.
Okay, so doesn't say button building there, it says 1 to 15 Cottage Street.
Here's the,
The National
Mills,
Mills
yeah.
complex, okay.
So it's just the Mills itself.
Yeah, I forget.
But button
I-
building would be good one to get on there anyway.
We'd have to look and see what was actually applied for and what's included, but if it just says 1 to 15, then that's not the button building, but,
Right.
um,
All right, well, let's move this along a little bit. I mean, we have our projects, I think we're pretty good at most of those at this point. So, and we could find a ton of them, because John is just full of ideas.
right. So last year, the CPA, you had said cemetery inventories and preservation, especially at the East Street Cemetery.
Yep.
Ground penetrating radar survey of historic sites, Platt Street, Fort Hill, Native American Fort of Mount Tom, Native American settlement at the Oxbow, and then update listings of structures around the city that are over 50 years old, and Old Waterworks building on Hendrick Street, historic architectural study and reuse plan.
It's privately owned now, right?
Hendrick Street, this is the.
Oh, Hendrick Street,
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Not the waterworks on the.
I gotcha.
So I don't know if all of those are still relevant, if there's any that we want
Pretty
to
much.
add that to go to the CPA, if that
Well-
order makes sense.
I would probably say the building inventories should come first, like I said before. And some of those other things, like all that after the ground penetrating radar, that's all actually one thing, all the way to the Indian Fort question. Those are all things that might potentially be resolved with an archaeological survey. And for example, the native settlement, that is Platt Street, that's also, so all of those are just really one thing, even though they seem like, well, I mean, I say one thing. They're one potential way of dealing with it. As it turns out, one of the questions that I'm putting to the UMass archaeological team is what would be the cost of some of those individually, because we're interested, but might depend on how much it is, which ones we did and which which order and how many. Initially, I had thought the thing that everybody seemed most interested in was the initial site of the first cemetery. And now I get the impression maybe actually the native settlement might be more, garner more support for a first run. And the fort, I think everybody would like to know, but when I had talked to them, they said, well, you know, once you get to the mountain, it's a whole different ballgame. Not only because it's a state park, but because it's forested and rocky, and you know, you're talking about a really.
Well, we were looking at it.
Yeah, and then we were debating where this fort might have been. Because all of the, well, there isn't much that really says, there really isn't anything that ever specified. It's mostly the place names that remain that give us our clues.
Well, this is 1873 map, so
Mhm.
goes back a ways. Obviously, it's not anywhere close to the mountain.
Although I
Here's
still.
the railroad tracks here, so
Yeah.
it'd be like that. And there's East Street. So it's down on this side of the tracks.
You know what, Mike? I wonder if
What is?
well, we're trying to figure out about the fort, excuse me. You know what I bet? I bet the settlement and the fort are one and the same. I bet they garrisoned the settlement.
Sure.
They would have at the time, in
Yeah.
fact. And so probably, because I just recently read The Unredeemed Captive, by the way, about Eunice Williams, who was taken in the Deerfield Massacre. All of that happens right here. In fact, there's Easthampton plays into the story, Northampton does. But having just read that, I think one of the things that catches my attention is that it was just sort of a blanket, fort was a blanket statement that didn't necessarily mean what I had initially thought fort would mean, which would be much more likely to be up on the mountain with a big overview. But if it was just like a palisade area, and that would make even more sense if the Indians had been living there, and then as problems and threats arise, they probably just threw up a garrison around that. So I bet it's one and the same. I bet the settlement and the fort are the same.
Well, plus, you know, you're up on a pretty good ridge there. You can see, especially like if you're off East Street, you can see into Northampton. So you can see anybody coming or whatever, so
That's true.
Advantageous position,
Yeah.
Of course, back then, who knows how many trees and whatnot were in the way, but probably not a lot.
Yeah.
They like to take them down.
Which reminds me that another one of the things we talked about was also the Mount Tom Village story, because Mount Tom Village has just been folded into Easthampton, and it has its own story, which ironically might very well tie into these pretty significantly.
Okay, well, we've been here an hour now.
Yeah.
So
Library right here.
this meeting's over here.
It should be modified because it's now not the Easthampton Public Library, it's the Emily Williston Library.
Was it always, or was it?
No, it used to be called the Easthampton Public Library, even though it wasn't public.
Yeah, anyways,
I was looking for it on Main Street, but it's
so.
technically park.
Yeah, it's like 14 or 9 park. Yeah, we should do something with this place before they ruin it. By a couple different methods. All right, so new business, we have, I guess one item we want to talk about is scheduling a regular meeting time. Nora's not here, so we can't get her input, but Jamie's, what's your good days?
Wednesdays would be great.
Wednesdays would be great.
Tuesdays, Tuesdays are, I can make it work, but it's harder.
Yeah.
And Thursdays I have, there's CPA committee once a month, so we just have to juggle around other committee schedules. But I guess I don't know what,
Yeah, what's good for you?
Same for me, basically, because I'm on the CPA, so we have potential conflicts on Thursdays. Wednesday's clear for me, Tuesday's clear, Friday's a bad day for meetings.
No meetings on Fridays. Building's not even open on Fridays.
Oh,
so.
good.
You know, you the same, pretty much?
I'm retired.
I know you're retired. Evidently, you're still working.
I have class on Wednesday, but it's 11 to 1:30, so it's not an issue.
All right, so, I mean, I'm flexible as far as that goes. You know, Wednesdays are okay with me, it's okay with everybody else.
Wasn't it Wednesday before?
It was Wednesday.
It was Wednesday before.
Wednesday
so, yeah.
before.
So we'll
Well,
go back.
I was gonna move it to Tuesdays because I have a meeting earlier in the day.
Oh, right.
To get them both out of the way, but I mean,
Bubble.
I can give that up, I don't care.
so if we go for Wednesdays,
Which week?
well, so the city council meets the first and third Wednesday of each
Second.
month, and the ZBA meets the fourth Wednesday,
Okay.
Wait,
which,
Thursday?
Wednesdays,
CPA?
ZBA.
Oh, ZBA.
And so that's my other committee, so if we wanted to do the second Wednesday
That one month?
of the month, then just plan on that.
That's fine,
Sure.
except for this month.
Right, so starting in October,
Okay.
second Wednesdays.
Sounds good.
And this room?
Yep.
Yeah, this is where all the records are, so even though our drawer has been,
Do you
We
do
used
you
to
want
have
me
a
to get
whole
ahold of
Now we only
Barbara
have
and
one.
reserve a room for that, like, in perpetuity?
I can do
Or
that,
you wanna
I
it
can do that tomorrow.
Okay, now you're here anyways.
Yeah, so beginning of
I try to
October.
avoid this building as much as I can.
Yeah, and I'm here, so,
Yeah.
you know, so that's the October, beginning of October 11th.
Okay. October 11th.
These back.
Let's see if that all works out.
At 6:30. And I will, do you want to email everyone, do you want me to email, send a mail to Myrna? Like, how do you,
You could mail her, yes. Yeah, I'm good with that one. I can take care of the notifications. So
Okay.
you want me to do that? I'll do
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
And then I'll do the agenda. Or do you want me to just send you the information and you get it out to everybody?
we can,
We can discuss that.
We can do that, we can do that.
Yeah.
I guess since you're the chair and you've been doing it, it makes sense for you to keep setting the agendas.
That's fine.
But, you know, I am in the building 3 days a week, and
Yeah.
if it's easier for us to like get on a schedule and like get, making it keep happening, you know, we can figure out
Yeah.
how to
Yeah.
keep moving it forward.
Okay. Sounds good. October 11th, you said, right?
Yeah, 6:30.
Yep. Except the days the tractors are out, we'll have to make it 6:45. Right, John? Okay, any old business that we need to rehash? And we already have it?
Can I just ask what the next step is for any of these things we started? Do you have any to-dos or?
At this point, well, I think the first to-do would be to, brainstorm some of this draft mission statements.
Scope and
stuff.
missions, okay.
And, yeah, if you could email out
Yeah.
the link to that, so people have it, and, it's a couple hard copies, or, like I said, 5 hard copies for the next meeting would be great. Yeah, and then we can, try to get our ideas together and see if we can do some homework.
And I did have a task to, reaching out to the UMass archaeological
Okay.
folks to ask them not only about additional sites, but also, since it's been a few years now since we got the quote, is the quote still good?
Right.
Do we need an update, that kind of thing.
And, yeah, I mean, I was, we've kind of interested in doing the cemetery thing, so I'm gonna probably take the lead on that.
Okay.
Barbara's gonna sort all the inventories evidently tonight.
Now, I want you to look at this drawer. I found some other stuff here.
Oh, this is-
What kind of order is that in?
Not
Disorder.
very good.
Okay.
Yeah. That's another project right there, actually, you know, redoing the file system and, you know, sorting through that.
I'm looking to see,
That
this
really seems
is
to,
Historical Society newsletters here,
Yeah.
Historic Consultant 1985,
Problem on the business?
grant application information, general information, Easthampton Conference, architectural styles, demolition delay bylaw.
yeah, well, the bylaws, the old, it's the same thing, it's just changed it to an ordinance when it became a city. The outline's pretty good.
I was looking to see if they had the National Historic Register stuff.
You may. All right, well, if there's no other old business, I think, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
I don't think she's gonna adjourn.
No. You wanna stay longer?
No, I don't wanna stay long.
Shall we adjourn?
I think we should adjourn. My dog's probably dying for a walk.
Can we take that as a motion?
I move that we adjourn.
I second.
Okay. Adjourn, thank you very much.